sing like the next band we're going to talk about also.
Mm-hmm. Damn right.
Good job, Josh.
Nice teaser there, Josh. Matt, why don't you fill in the gaps of who that is?
So this is Suicide's Suicide from 1977, coming in at number 127 in the 1970s on Best Ever Albums, number 17 in 1977, number 546 of all time, and it made Rolling Stone's list just barely at number 498. And it is their highest rated album on Best Ever Albums.
Another band that I had not heard their music before. I think I heard their name in passing, and I know John's mentioned them in reference.
Superfan Jeff is a big fan of this band.
Yeah,
big time.
Well, I'm glad we've done this show because I feel like everything that we've listened to up to this point has prepared me for this moment to understand what Suicide is and who they are as a band. To put it shortly, they are American electronic music. They are what America took from the krautrock scene and some of the other things that we've heard, like Velvet Underground and even Bowie to a certain extent, and merge that into electronic music with a drum machine and synth. I think it's very stripped down. It's very spare and sparse. It could be considered basic on some level, although I don't think it's that necessarily. And they have a very menacing sound to them. It's a repeating, with the drum machine, they have a repeating tempo on a lot of their songs, and very steady, kind of hypnotic feel to them. And they are also not afraid to go into screaming, which is on that song Frankie, which is also the longest song and was the hardest one to get through, in my opinion. I thought I was ready, after all the other stuff we listened to, that I could, listen to anything, but that was tough to get through. What else
could it be? Because he's murdering his wife and his kid and giving you all the noises behind all that and himself?
Oh no, I didn't pick up on that.
Is that what's happened? Is that, yeah? Okay.
Okay. But I can see, I think this is an essential band from, a historical perspective and from a music history or a music appreciation perspective. It was hard to, with one listen, I would need more to kind of pull out the other things I appreciated about it, but broad strokes, it was interesting. It wasn't my favorite of the, of other albums that we talked about this week were more interesting and that I would go back to, but this was, I'm glad I filled in this gap by listening to the album.
I've tried to avoid this album for a long time because I know the reputation of this album, and I kind of, if we weren't doing something like, I've been told to listen to this album many, many times. I'll be honest, I have avoided this album because I'm aware that it has a sonic template, and it was everything I thought it was going to be. I'll be honest with you. It sounds like New York City in the late 70s. It almost feels like the soundtrack for an element of New York City. As Josh said, this is like where krautrock and certain sounds ended up on the American front, right? And it makes sense that it would end up in New York, right? Because of course it would. That's where it's going to come if it's going to come. God, it's like it's nihilistic sonically and lyrically.
Yeah.
When there's lyrics, they are bleak. There's times when there aren't lyrics, right? And so it goes in and out. It is an interesting compare and contrast with like the Bowie albums that we're listening to, and Eno and Kraftwerk and Neu, and because those are not menacing albums. They can be cold, you know what I mean, and sort of synthetic feeling and icy, but they're not like nihilistic, right? This is a nihilistic sound. This this has elements of White Light, White Heat from the Velvet Underground
Yes,
in
definitely.
it. This has elements of stuff that Trent Reznor would do later, or Aphex Twin was another band that came to mind that, kind of sonically, but I don't think anything suitably prepared me for like it's funny because I was like listening to this album as I was leaving the gym, right? And like, when and we're talking Frankie, I mean, you can't talk about this album without talking Frankie Teardrop, because it's right in the middle of the album, which placement is, I thought it was a very interesting place to put it, because you're kind of like being like, I won't say lulled into it, because there's a sound that has you on edge a little bit, and then it's basically the story of a person having a psychotic break, right? Like, I mean, you don't get lyrics as bleak as basically someone actively describing taking a gun out and blowing away their infant child, and then their wife, and then themselves, right? And the visceral scream. I mean, it's like someone. Like, I remember there's that term nightmare fuel, right? Like, that's like what that track is, I can't think of, I mean, I'm trying to think of songs that are as terrifying as that song. I mean, there's like, I remember the Tori Amos song, right? That's about her rape. That's pretty remarkably stark, right? Like, in a different, you know what I mean? Like, it's a very visceral, deep song. It's like Me and a Gun, I think it's called, or something like that. It's, I don't know. That's another one. There just weren't many songs I could pick up that were quite as bleak, sonically. Mm-hmm. It's got that industrial feel where it feels almost inhuman at times.
Yeah.
It's a very important piece of music because it fuses together a lot of stuff and also serves as connective tissue to a lot of different electronic music and sounds down the road. But I don't know if I'll be interested to listen to some of those albums in the 80s to see if anything gets as bleak as this does, because this was a hard listen. It was falls in the it's not for everybody. It's most important, I think, for people that are going on a journey like we are, or want to be completists or understand it. I think I won't say it's essential, but it's, as Josh said, it's, especially when you've seen bits and pieces before or after, it's very helpful as connective tissue. But there are lots of people who you do not need to listen to this album, because you can get bits and pieces of it from other people, and you don't need to go the full ride into this. Very disturbing album. Very interesting album. Very another thing I want to mention, in its own way, simple. And I'll go another thing, even though it's got a little bit of like what trip hop is, where there's those uneasy sort of simplicity in songs that actually seem more complicated, even though there's not a lot going on, but it seems more complex. So I actually picked up a little bit of that trip hop vibe to it as well, that's there. Not as much sonically as more like compositionally. So I'll jump off there. As much I'll be interested here, Matt, because as much as I heard that Dennis Wilkes album going one way, I listened to this, I thought, ooh, with Matt, I'm curious to see what he thinks of this. So
I think this kind of sucked. I mean,
I didn't think you would like this as much as I knew you'd like Dennis Wilson. I thought you'd hate this album.
No, I think I did. I will a couple of things. I think that there was certainly promise here, and I think one of my biggest gripe with this is that there's elements here that start off, ooh, that's a cool sound, right? Or that's a cool little melodic thing that's going on, or that's a cool little beat, whatever. It certainly pulled me in right away. There's elements that I liked, but the fact that none of these songs really built off of that, they didn't really add layers to it. They didn't really add new instrumentation. They didn't add, it's not even like that there wasn't like, oh, here's the chorus, right? It wasn't even, I don't need like that, structured of a song necessarily, but man, it would have been a lot more interesting and a lot better if they would have kicked some drums in and then throw that little synth and throw this part in and kind of made it more of a I don't know, like a movement, as opposed to kind of just bringing you somewhere, like kind of starting you off somewhere and then just plateauing throughout the rest of the song and kind of just hanging on that for several minutes. And to me, it felt flat. It just felt boring. I was like, okay, I get it, right? Like it's not a horrible sound. Like like I said, I kind of liked elements of it, but man, it just doesn't go anywhere, And I think that was my biggest issue with it. So yeah, it's just kind of left. I'm like, so to me, it was kind of like, what's the point? I don't necessarily mind kind of the sparseness of it or like the krautrock elements, because I definitely picked up on that. And there was plenty of the krautrock stuff that I did like. And it just, not in this form for this sustained period, just hanging on to that one thing that they do throughout the song. So wasn't a really pleasant experience. Yeah. And by the time Frankie Teardrop comes along, it's really, really long, and then he does those screams, those like blood-curdling screams that are just the farthest thing from a pleasant listening experience that I could describe. Actually, I want to read to you what Rolling Stone said in their description, which is really brief. It says, New York synth punk Suicide evoked the Velvet Underground via 50s rockabilly. Yep. Alan Vega's screams and Martin Rev's violent electronics are weirdly captivating, but late night listening to Frankie Teardrop, a 10-minute tale of a multiple murder, is not recommended. So so even within the album, like the longest song here is even like admittingly that's not something you might want to listen to. So I can't get down with it. This is, as John said, this is not for everybody. This album is certainly not for me.
Yeah, I know that Frankie Teardrop's one of Bruce Springsteen's favorite songs ever.
God, really?
Oh yeah, no, like he's always on the record as saying that.
Jeez, that's a brutal listening experience.
Well, it's designed to be.
Yeah,
that's like,
I know.
It's designed to be. I mean, your fucking name of your band is Suicide. So I mean, you're already like, and I left something out, by the way. There's a large element of performance art in this, much like the spirit of the Velvet Underground, also a New York band. And like, once again, when I talk about like New York in the late '60s until like the mid '80s, it's a place that's not like any other place in America, and the acts coming out of New York reflect that, and we've got two tonight, right? Suicide and the Ramones. They're very much, reflections on New York, right? There's an edge to New York acts that just doesn't exist anywhere else in the 70s. There just doesn't, like, and New York's an interesting place. It's kind of where everybody goes to get away from where they didn't want to live anymore, right? And there's an element of that. And Suicide, I mean, as I read here, Suicide's, their ethos, right, is they start in the early to mid 90s, or 70s, in New York. And like their idea was that like, one member of the group, Rev here, would create like spooky dissonant keyboards, like, the likes of which you'd hear throughout the 80s and 90s. But the sound is like it's a different version of that like Velvet Underground krautrock sound, but like you can hear this all throughout the 80s and 90s, in any number of industrial or techno or synth driven bands, right? And then Vega just went up there and kind of like, what's his name? The guy from Can, right? He's like sort of just spoken wording it, designed to make you like uncomfortable. And like they said like part of their vibe was that Vega, the lead singer, would become confrontational with the crowd and bait them and put them into like a frenzy. And like their shows often ended with like full blown violence with the crowd attacking him. And like that was the vibe they were going for, And I mean, as a result, like this album was designed to be uncomfortable, and that's a tough spot, because when a band says my artistic statement is to be, that's why I knew you'd hate it, Matt, because it's like that is not you as a human being. And so as a result, it isn't always me, but it can be, and Josh, I feel like, is a little bit more, like he can go there, you know what I mean, in a way easier than the rest of us. But
you guys are troubled.
I don't think you have to be troubled though to like listen to stuff that's deep, like I really don't. Like, it's not easy to listen to Frankie Teardrop, but it didn't.
I don't know. I equate it to like, I always say this about like horror films, like scary movies. I'm like, why do I want to sit in a dark room for 2 hours and get terrified? That's not a fun feeling for me. You know what I mean? Like, I like there's certain aspects of people getting pleasure out of being like fairly uncomfortable. That just doesn't. I don't get that. I just it's never, whether it's music or a movie or something like that. It's if something's really disturbing, I don't know. Chances are I'm not going to like it. Like, it just doesn't seem fun.
But horror movies sell millions of dollars.
I know.
And so, like, that's what I'm saying. It's not for everybody.
No.
But it absolutely has something to say if you're... There's nothing wrong with not being willing to invite yourself into this space. You know, that's why I stayed away from this album for so long. Cause I'm like, I don't know if I want to go there. You know what I mean? Like, I kind of know, I kind of knew, like I said, nothing about this album surprised me in the sense of thematically, because like I said, you don't name your band Suicide unless you're not trying to grab attention. You know what I mean? It's by design, you know?
Yeah.
And, yeah, so...
I mean, maybe we need that. Maybe we need to get shaken up here and there, like, to get challenged and you know, and all that stuff. It's just, you know, if I have my druthers, I'm just going to...
Well, considering every fifth podcast, or maybe third podcast post that I see an advertisement when we're on Twitter is something about true crime, you know, podcasts. There's, you know what I'm saying? It's not like this is some sort of, like, you know... and with women, you know what I mean? You'd think, but like it's a lot is that genre, so it's not always traditionally who you'd think of, right? Like the nurturing sex, but also there's this like, let's take a look. You know, we don't have to be the devil to take a look at the devil. You know,
that's true though too, because now I think about it, there's definitely television shows and other things that I watch that some might call disturbing. It's just done in a different way that is less disturbing for me, perhaps, or less, I don't know, something like I could watch something like The Wire or whatever. There's plenty of disturbing things about that show, but
or like Everybody Loves Raymond, you know, it's really disturbing for me, you know, in terms of what it says about the American family.
Fair enough. So I guess that's not. I guess I can't say that because I'm sure I am guilty of that. Other people would kind of question why I would want to entertain myself by engaging in certain things. So yeah, it probably is just a taste thing. So.
We also don't talk about a lot of bands that have such a strong artistic statement to make as it sounds like Suicide did. I mean, when you name your band Suicide, that's kind of a statement in of itself. You kind of know that they're about something, I would think, or you know, they're trying to evoke a feeling when you name your band that. And so it sounds like that's what they did. A movie kind of equivalent, I think, that kind of captures what this band sounds like, and maybe New York at the time too, is Taxi Driver, because that came out in '76, and that is very much of the time before, you know, New York City rebuilt itself into this, you know, tourist friendly you know, Mecca, shining city, and it was very grimy, and Travis Bickle kind of captures that, you know, as skewed as his view on the world is. I think Scorsese was also trying to capture what New York was like during that time, and that feeling and unease, and I think Suicide is doing the same thing.
Yeah, two final comments on this. Number one is, while this doesn't sound like punk rock, this operates in the same like headspace, you know, at number one. And number two, we haven't covered a lot of like industrial or electronic music yet outside of Krautrock and Bowie, and they're doing something different. Like the lineage of this in terms of albums were covered in the 80s and 90s is all over, whether it's like New Order or Depeche Mode or Nine Inch Nails later, or all of trip hop or Aphex Twin, or even things like Daft Punk. I mean, all that stuff, you know, kind of originates from kind of where this is, you know, that sort of sparse, you know, drum and bass like sounds, right? That kind of creates a vibe, you know. That's we're going to see that all over in critically acclaimed albums, like to the point where probably we're going to look back on this and go, all right, that's where it started. But we really haven't been in that drum bass like space yet, and this was our first entree into it. So sonically, I just do want to point out that this is the beginning of that type of sound.
No, also, and that's a good point too. I'm just thinking of Nine Inch Nails, and I think that their music is disturbing, but I like Nine Inch Nails, and I think that this probably just goes back to my main complaint about this record is just that how it hits that thing that it does, and it remains static throughout the rest of the song. And I would like this a lot more if it varied that up. And I think that's probably my biggest issue. It's not so much although the screaming is not pleasant. I don't need the screaming, but that's just one part of one song. The main thing for me is it doesn't build. It doesn't, it doesn't do anything really, kind of just stays in its place. And I wish it would do more. So
sometimes the mundaneness is more uneasy, than the,
yeah, that's fair. No, that's
sometimes
fair, John.
static is more unnerving than kinetic.
Nope, that's a good point.
That, there's an element of that to this too, isn't there?
Yep.
Also, an artist that we haven't mentioned in a long time, but who is still making music and increasingly moves into this industrial space is Scott Walker.
That's a good point. And
tying it back to that Bowie, Bowie was always very into Scott Walker, and yeah, he definitely shifts into that industrial sound in his career at some point.
And you can see how that would happen, can't you? In terms of how he delivered. I mean, yeah, he was crooning, but I think I told you, that Scott Walker album was like a different experience in the afternoon when I listened to it, and then at 11 o'clock when I listened to it. And some of that was that same idea. There was a lot of space to project into. Yep. So, great point, Josh. Love it.